Average is a word that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Growing up as an Asian kid with westernized Asian parents, my perception of average meant getting a B on my report card, which is probably the reason I'm one of those people that rates things based on the idea that 7 out of 10 is average. I won't get into what that actually means for any of the arbitrary numbers I've given out to anime over the past 7-ish years, but it has made me realize that some of my 7s are more like 5s and some of them are more like 8s. And then there's Amagami SS, which sits exactly where I remember putting it for all the right reasons. Now, if you haven't seen Amagami SS, there's probably nothing about the promo art or synopsis that'll convince you that you should. It's a 2010 visual novel adaptation, which was an extremely run-of-the-mill type of show at the time, and honestly, I don't think I could really sell this show to anyone without just showing them a few episodes. Because despite the completely generic look and ideas behind Amagami SS, it has something that I feel like a lot of other generic shows try to replace with quirky over-the-top storylines and characters. It has heart. Hear me out. Looking at the characters, none of them really stand out, but it's in this sort of blandness that you actually realize just how good their designs are. Unlike most anime that just apply whatever color scheme they feel like to characters' hair, eyes, and clothing, all of Amagami SS's characters actually look and act like Japanese people. Hair and eyes are black or brown without any stupid gimmicky styling, which gives room to make sure that their faces and silhouettes are more unique while still not being unrealistic oppai monsters or bodybuilders. And I'm pretty sure I've met Japanese people that act like at least one of each character in the show, possibly to slightly less exaggerated degrees, but that's to be expected because we still want the show to be more entertaining than actual real life. Honestly, the most exaggerated part of any of the characters is the fact that Haruka has blue eyes because she's a quarter British. But given that most anime characters that are even the tiniest fraction Caucasian have blonde hair and blue eyes, this hardly even registers. Also, my boy Junichi is just a mega chad that manages to do in 4 episodes what most romance and harem protagonists never accomplish until the end of their series. And he does it 6 times. But not misogynistically, since each time he ends up with one of the heroines, the next story resets back to the beginning, leading into a separate wholesome romance with a different girl. ReZero? Steins Gate? Step aside. The best time travel anime is Amagami SS, and everyone who disagrees is just salty because they'll never be as chad as Junichi. Anyway, that was a bit of a long intro, but if you've seen my videos, you know that I'm not here to do full anime reviews because, well, those are super easy to find anywhere. And honestly, I don't really think my opinion on series as a whole is super worthwhile to listen to. What I think Amagami actually does well, and not just average good, but legitimately exceeds expectations with, is its soundtrack. Amagami is one of those slice of life shows that, for whatever reason, has a soundtrack that just blows away a ton of shows that are far better than it in every other way. I hadn't heard of composer Omori Toshiyuki until this soundtrack, but he's worked on quite a lot of projects as either a composer or arranger. Most notably Evangelion, the original Shaman King, and School Rumble, to name a few. I don't know why so many slice of life shows have such stellar soundtracks, but I'm all for it if it means getting to listen to more music like this. I mean, this is just pure fun, plain and simple. I don't have any jazz training, so I can't speak too much to what's going on the more technical side of things, but every time I hear that sax come in, I can't help smiling and grooving along to it. And one of the things that makes it so great is, as I mentioned about the show as a whole, the heart and character this track has. The show doesn't really have any character themes per se, but if we associate the pieces that play during the episode previews for each respective arc, this one would serve as Kaoru's theme, which makes total sense. Kaoru and Haruka are the 2 most upbeat and energetic heroines in the series, but Kaoru is the more tomboyish character that acts kind of like one of Junichi's bros, whereas Haruka is the attractive senpai that's far out of his league. This playful track outlines both Kaoru's fun personality, but also the more casual relationship that Junichi has with her when they aren't dating. Musically, there isn't actually too much going on in terms of layers, but it it sounds quite busy given the quick tempo and the natural way that the musicians play off of one another, reflecting the busy life Kaoru lives between going to school and working her part-time job. And before I forget, the actual recording quality for this whole soundtrack is just top-notch. Major props to the mixing and recording engineers because the level of sound quality on these tracks reminds me of Princess Connects, which again makes me wonder just why such amazing sound production and composition is going to shows and games that wouldn't necessarily need it to succeed. I'm certainly glad that they received it, but it's the level of quality that could put some AAA anime soundtracks to shame simply because of how good the actual sound quality is. Again, if we take the preview card themes as each heroine's respective theme, this is Haruka's theme. The heroine who is indisputably best grill, fight me. Also, I don't know who wrote this wiki page, but whoever you are...
You a genius. I appreciate you.
Like Kaoru, Haruka is a bundle of energy, but because her character is a beautiful senpai instead of a bro, her theme takes on a less buddy-buddy jam sesh sound, opting for a more rehearsed bossa nova. The choice to use strings and a jazz flute gives the music a lighter atmosphere, more closely matching the way that Haruka is perceived by her peers. The bossa nova beat has a groove you could easily dance along to, capturing her playful side, while the lighter atmosphere of the track is more reflective of her love of cute things like puppies. This might also just be an overanalysis on my part, but the overall sound of this track gives it a bit of distance, especially when we compare it to Kaoru's theme from before. Kaoru's jam sesh style piece felt quite in your face, reflecting the relationship she has with Junichi. The improvisational quality made it feel like something that any one of the musicians could have jumped into with a solo at almost any given moment, akin to a lively conversation with friends where anyone could simply say something when the timing is right. Haruka's, on the other hand, has a more performance-like quality, one where, despite being jazzy in its own right, sounds like it's meant to be listened to instead of added onto. The flute and strings are obviously leading the melody, but they're always playing together, making it sound much more rehearsed and, going with the conversation analogy, more like a speech than a dialogue, reflecting Junichi's idol-like admiration of her even after they managed to become friends and more in her arc. Of course, Amagami's main genre is romance, focusing on the relationships that Junichi and the heroines develop while also giving us a reason to root for Junichi after he was stood up by his Christmas date 2 years prior to the start of the anime. Given the title of the track, it's quite easy to understand just how the lush string runs really capture the sense of excitement and anxiousness at discovering that your feelings have shifted into something more than just friendship. Here, Omori cleverly has the first violins and cello playing in unison to represent Junichi and the heroine, keeping their rhythms the same while the pitches are written to harmonize and come closer together. This piece is also just an absolutely beautiful representation of using secondary dominants to move around the circle of fifths, changing keys pretty much every 4 bars or so to keep the relatively simple melody moving. This is simple enough to interpret as the characters' feelings changing over time, shifting smoothly but rapidly from one state to the next as they come to realize that they like each other. And while I doubt Omori took this into consideration while he was composing the piece, it also nicely represents how the characters develop these feelings relatively quickly, as each arc is only 4 episodes and this track usually plays somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd depending on which heroine's story it is. On top of just having fantastic music, there also isn't any shortage of styles and genres despite the fact that, again, the show is mostly just a slice-of-life rom-com. Given that the story of Amagami is set in modern-day Japan, it seems fitting that at least one piece of music would be something, well, Japanese. And given that Rihoko, Junichi's childhood friend and one of the heroines, is a member of the tea ceremony club, this piece of music is extremely fitting. For those who aren't aware, tea ceremony is one of Japan's many traditional art forms, much like flower arrangement, and so the choice to write a duet for Japan's traditional instruments, the koto and shakuhachi, seems only natural for such a situation. I don't have a huge amount of knowledge when it comes to traditional Japanese art forms, though the little that I do have can tell me that this piece, despite sounding quite traditional, is much more contemporary than a traditional piece would be, at least conceptually. A major philosophy in traditional Japanese art forms is that of Johakkyu, an ideology in its simplest terms that means to begin slowly, speed up, and end swiftly. Assuming that this piece was simply meant to accompany a scene, it makes sense that the intensity does not change much, opting for a singular, continuous atmosphere in the scenes associated with the tea ceremony club, but in doing so, it acts only as a surface-level piece of music to set a scene. Regardless of its authenticity, however, it is still pleasant to hear and far more fitting than a more contemporary ensemble of instruments would be for this particular theme. Of course, the soundtrack isn't all youthful butterfly-inducing melodies or scene-specific tracks. This is one of the more recognizable pieces from the soundtrack because it not only creates a stark contrast to most of the more happy pieces, but also links back to why we became invested in Junichi's story in the first place. This piece of music plays almost every time Junichi thinks back on the night he was stood up, leading to his fear of rejection and sort of wishy-washy personality. While he has a vastly different relationship with each of the girls in the show, he always displays a slight apprehension when faced with more important decisions, regardless of whether he builds up the nerve to actually go through with it or holds himself back. I talked quite a bit about how the sparse reverberant piano in Land of the Lustrous and Nagi no Asukara was used to create a lonely sound and underwater atmosphere respectively, on top of how the piano itself is the instrument most associated with nostalgia in film scores. But somehow here it doesn't quite fit any of those definitions, at least not completely. The sparse chords do evoke a lonesome sound, and the sound of the piano does tie the music and atmosphere to Junichi's past, albeit regrettably rather than nostalgically, but something about it doesn't seem nearly as dramatic as Land of the Lustrous or Nagi no Asukara, and while it's possible that it's simply because I already know the context, I think it really comes down to the relatively light reverb and the lack of a true bass line, which would give the music a heavier, darker feeling. And given that Junichi's situation isn't exactly traumatic, nor did it leave him with any unreasonable fears about relationships, the middling heaviness of the piece creates a perfect amount of drama to associate with his current way of living, being a regular high schooler with a fear of rejection. This is one of the two themes in the show that somehow manages to capture the entirety of what Amagami is all about, this theme taking more of Junichi's overarching storyline from the failed Christmas date to the end of his romance arc, while the other focuses more on the beginning of Junichi and the heroine's blossoming romance. Once again, this is another track in which Omori makes liberal use of key changes and tonality shifts to represent the ever-changing feelings of the characters. We start off with a slightly unsettling piano solo, not scary or imposing, but just a bit melancholic. We can relate this to Junichi's past, much like how we did with the previous track, with the unresolving cadences representing his lingering feelings from that fateful night. The track is quick to evolve, however, adding in some strings to make the piece feel a bit lighter, despite the fact that the chords are all the same. These strings represent the heroine coming into his life, her mere presence helping to dispel the regret he wasn't able to let go of. The oboe acts as the actual heroine herself, bringing him along down a new path where he doesn't need to worry about what happened in his past because, quite simply, she'll be there to fill the void. Through the oboe's melody, we can hear that this path will have its share of ups and downs, but ultimately things will come out on a high note, both literally and figuratively. This final chord is also fairly open-ended, leaving room for the future of their relationship, some of which we get to catch glimpses of in both the first and second seasons. And this is the final track I want to talk about. The story theme focused on the romance aspect between Junichi and the heroines. Unlike the previous track, which opened with a slightly unsettling piano solo, this one opens with a beautiful string ensemble playing sixth chords back and forth, creating a sense of openness while also immediately referencing the romance beginning to blossom. This opening on the strings is followed by a lighthearted piano solo, contrasting the other piano pieces we've heard thus far with its more hopeful and song-like melody. Given the title of the piece being in the past tense and the Japanese translating more literally to the place where love is born, this gives us a sense that this is somewhat of a reflective track being told from a future perspective, as if Junichi is looking back on how he met the heroines. This gives reason to the nostalgic sound of the piano, as well as the presence of the strings creating romantic textures and undertones. Towards the middle of the piece, things get a bit more dramatic with the addition of a D sharp, creating a minor third between D sharp and F sharp. We've already discussed how Omori is no stranger when it comes to utilizing secondary dominants, and this use of the B major chord gives a more cathartic resolution to E minor, the relative minor of our home key, before winding back down to set up the return to G major. This is a pretty clear way to represent the hardships Junichi and the respective heroine had to overcome in order to get to where they are now. And given that the piece returns to a repetition of the beginning, followed by an equally lighthearted outro portion, this gives us the sense that regardless of whether or not we actually see what the future holds for Junichi and the girls, we know that things will turn out alright. I don't normally cover this many pieces of music when I do these more casual soundtrack reviews because it's usually pretty easy to get the gist of the music after hearing 3 or 4 pieces. Even when there's a large variety of music to listen to, I rarely find myself so captivated with a soundtrack the way I was with Amagami SS, and while I was able to explain a lot about its music, I still don't have any specific reasons for why I'm so in love with it. It isn't overly dramatic, and the tracks that seem a bit over the top are only ever used during comedic scenes in the show. Even the heavier pieces only seem to be as dramatic as the events occurring in the characters' lives, which we already know doesn't really go into the realm of ridiculousness, at least not in the first season. The show as a whole is nothing special, and yet I can't consider it just a guilty pleasure because I legitimately think just about every aspect of it is good, and the only description I can think of to describe it to anyone who hasn't seen it is pleasantly average. Even then, that sounds more like an insult than actual praise, so the only advice I can give if you're one of those people is, well, just go watch it and see for yourself. But I also have a penchant for slice of life shows and rom-coms, so I could just be equating my preferences for the show having great production quality. If nothing else, I don't think anyone could really argue that the soundtrack is bad, though I do kind of understand why some people would notice it given how well it fits the atmosphere of the show. But let me know what you guys thought of the music in Amagami SS, and if you know of any other overlooked anime OSTs, make sure to let me know down in the comment section below. I really like sharing soundtracks from shows that don't get as much attention as the popular ones because it helps spread appreciation for an aspect that I think most people tend to ignore. So if you want to find out about more relatively niche shows and their awesome soundtracks, make sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. You can also help support me over on Patreon, where you'll have access to things like all the transcriptions I do for all my videos, including this one. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you in the next one.